Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to TA Live. We are recording this event, and the record button has been pushed. My name is Sherry Conrad with the Resource Materials and Technology Center for the Deaf, Hard of Hearing. I will be monitoring the room for our presenter. Welcome to this one-hour webinar titled How to Determine Testing Accommodations Based on Data. After the presentation is complete, we will take questions. At the top of your screen, you should see two icons. One is a speaker to turn on the audio. The second one looks like a person raising their hand. You can use that to communicate quick information with the presenter, such as agreement, disagreement, speak louder, or slow down. The chat box down below in the bottom left-hand corner is for asking questions and making comments during our presentation. Today we have Scott Treble from the Florida School for the Deaf and Blind. Scott has worked in the field of deaf education for 15 years. He was in the classroom for 8 years, teaching elementary and middle school students who are deaf and hard of hearing, including those with additional disabilities. Scott is currently working as the Assessment and Accountability Coordinator at FSDB. In his role, he monitors and trains staff on IEP compliance, as well as ensures students' state tests and assessment needs are being met. And now, RMTC is proud to welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Excited to be here with you today. So we are going to start out today on speaking about classroom accommodations, and after we speak about classroom accommodations, we'll shift to state assessment accommodations as well. So one of the first things that I always like to talk about is making sure that we know. All right, let me adjust here. Give me just 1 second. All right, let's see if that sounds any better. I get a thumbs up or a hand wave if you can hear, or in the chat box. Okay, perfect. So one of the first things I like to talk about is making sure that we know what the difference is between a modification and an accommodation. So as you see here, modifications are really focusing on students working towards different expectations. And that may include changing the outcome or the content delivered to the students. Most often when we think about this, we look at students who are using access points. So they're not working on the state standard, but they have a reduced standard or a different standard that they're expected to meet to be able to identify the information that they know. And then accommodations as well. It really looks at making sure that the students' needs are being appropriately assessed through how they're demonstrating their performance, how they access the information, and such. All right, so one of my former bosses would always talk about accommodations, and she would reference the Chinese menu and mention that accommodations aren't just like menu. You don't just choose which ones you think you'd like that day, or, well, usually I choose this one, so I think I'm going to try that one again. So we don't get to do that. And often as teachers, we like that to provide students the most opportunities that we can. So we think, well, they may need this accommodations just in case. But what can happen is that by providing some of those accommodations that may be unnecessary or inappropriate for the student, it could actually have the opposite effect on the student and provide a detriment to the student. One thing that I neglected to mention at the outset is you should see a file pod there which has this presentation as well as the two documents that I used as a basis for the presentation today as well. How many of the individuals out there in your districts use Peer as their system for IEPs? Could I get a quick information in the chat box just so we can see? Okay, looks like a good number of you do use Peer as your IEP platform. So one of the things that you'll notice in Peer is that it has guiding questions before the teachers or whomever is completing the IEP fills out the information on accommodations. It does give you these 4 guiding questions. And these questions are helpful in making sure that we're actually providing the students what they need. One of the downloads that you'll see is actually the QIEP manual, which also has those questions and gives more in-depth information on the guiding questions. So for the first one, making sure we know what instructional tasks are difficult for the students to do independently. And really we have to compare that with what the student is expected to do in the general curriculum. And understanding, okay, what are they expected to do and what tasks are difficult for them to do. And we can use information from any assessments that we provided to the student. It can be your progress monitoring, your classroom assessments, as well as any observation or just anecdotal notes that you may have on your students as well. And that information really should be documented in your present level of performance on the IEP. So it forms a foundation for the student to know why they need that information. And also, we should always look at making sure we're checking back to see what accommodations the student has previously had on their IEP and if those accommodations are still needed for the student. Then secondly, after we determine what are the difficult areas for the student, we should really be thinking about trying to break down the tasks to understand where is the element that is difficult for the student. So as we break down those gaps for the student, we can really look at and understand what are the accommodations that the student may need at that level. And then a little bit later, we're going to talk about how we can or what accommodations are going to allow the student to access the information and show their performance, as well as determining if an accommodation is effective. The DOE has provided a manual in 2013. It's called Selecting Accommodations, Guidance for Individual Education Plan Teams. And one of the diagrams that they have in there is just that, a task analysis, looking at 5 critical elements of each task that may be difficult for the student. So looking at the cognitive, any sensory, motor, social-emotional, or communication issues for the student. And being able to determine what are they expected to do, what they can actually do, and if there is a gap somewhere in between. So this slide indicates for this student, the task was the student was having difficulty lining up in the classroom. And they broke down the different elements looking at what is the cognitive requirements for lining up in the classroom, and then what the student can do. And then they identified that there were no gaps in that area for the student. As far as sensory, looking at student recognizing the spoken instruction to get in line. Well, the student can't hear, so there is a gap. So we need to look at what kind of accommodation would be necessary for the student. You see it breaks it down in each of those areas. Most of the tasks that you would look at would have most of those critical elements, if not all of them, as you look at that. So something important to note is once you've identified, let me just step back a slide, once you've identified where the gap is, it becomes important to recognize what are the options, the accommodations that the student would be able to use, as well as looking at, are any of these gaps anything that can be filled in through using your universally designed for learning UDL practices. So oftentimes we find that students may not want to use an accommodation because it makes them different, But if we're providing those accommodations at the universal design level for students, not only students who have an IEP, we may find that it benefits the whole classroom as well. So once you know that there is a gap, then you need to look about discussing as an IEP team, selecting what those accommodations are. Again, you've provided the information for where the gaps are. You've informed the team, based on my data, this is where the student is struggling. These are the tasks and where exactly where the breakdown is falling. So now we need to discuss what are the accommodations that may meet the needs of that student. It's really important to include all of the different IEP team members, because every team member brings with them their own experience and their own area of skill that they may be able to provide an insight that you alone, as the teacher of the deaf or hard of hearing, may not have considered. So those 5 areas are looking at, is the accommodation necessary? Can they do it independently? Is it a skill that they'll be able to generalize? Is it something that's going to be acceptable to the student? And then also, is it something that is allowed on the FSA assessment? So when we look at if an accommodation is necessary, it's pretty straightforward. Is it something that's actually going to reduce the effects of the disability or eliminate the uneven playing field that may be there? And is it something that is going to allow the student to be able to accomplish what they're setting out to do? Whereas when we look at independence, we really need to look at, is the accommodation that's provided to the student something that is easy for them to use? You should always look at, as a team, to provide the simplest tool possible that the child could use to be able to accomplish that. As we look at students and we think, oh, this skill would be, or this accommodation would be great for the student, but it's so complex and cumbersome, it's really difficult for the student to be able to gauge and engage with that accommodation, so likely they're not going to use it. And then as well is making sure that the accommodation is going to help them have that stepping stone to be able to move forth and to actually become more independent in their skills and not needing to depend on someone to provide that for them. Another area that we need to look at is making sure that the skills are generalizable if possible. And we know some skills are going to be specific to one area, and that is what's necessary for that child. But often we'll see that students do have gaps that will impact them throughout all the various classes that they're in. So if we consider that when looking at accommodations, we need to make sure that we're looking for, is this a task that's, or an accommodation that they can use across the different classrooms, across the different classes that they're taking. And then not only applies to academic skills, but if it was something that they could also apply to any of their other areas as well outside of academics. And then I often worked with middle school students and really checking with the students, usually about the end of elementary school. We've seen students be more willing and able to participate in their IEP meetings. And oftentimes, including their input is so important, because the student's going to tell you, I've already tried that accommodation. It's something that I've used in the past and it no longer works for me, or it's something that I never was able to use effectively. And so if the student already has a frustration level with a certain accommodation, then they're probably not going to use it. So if the student is unwilling to use an accommodation, we have it on the IEP, it really sets up a conflict there. And if we're saying we're providing something but the student's refusing to use it, why is it even on there if the student is not using it? Now, we may need to look at, has the student been properly trained to use that accommodation? Or even, was that accommodation something that was maybe a little bit too difficult for the student and something that we could simplify that they would actually use? And of course, perception is everything, and especially in the middle school, high school, you don't want to look any different from your friends. You don't want to have an accommodation that is different from the students. I remember one student I taught needed to use large print so he could see effectively the text. However, the large print assessment books are pretty cumbersome, and the student often didn't want to use the large print because of that, because it made him look different from his peers. And so we really need to look at what is the accommodation, and sometimes it could be even training for the student to say, this is your need, and this is why you need to use it, and helping them work through that social emotional aspect so that they would actually look to use that accommodation. And then again, looking at the universal design aspect of accommodations. Is that an accommodation that if the general education teacher provided to all of their students may benefit them as well, and then would help that student be at ease to use that accommodation in their various settings? So one of the other templates that is in the Selecting Accommodations Guide is this template that's specific for looking at those 5 areas of possible accommodation. So if we know there's a need for anything, we can put down a couple different ideas of accommodations that may be necessary, and then look at each of those areas to determine if it meets those criteria that we just talked about. Is it necessary? Is it something that's going to allow the student to be independent? Is it something they can generalize? And is it acceptable to the student? Because what we may find out through that discussion is, even though we may think as educators that this would benefit the student or is good for them, that they say, not so much, I'm not going to use it. This next slide here looks at a student, and this was taken from the examples out of the book, who had a difficulty with note-taking during lectures. Is a deaf student who has trouble hearing on his left side. And so we can note down in the sensory section that the student, there's a gap there. The student has difficulty hearing on the left side and has difficulty listening and writing the notes at the same time, as well as processing the meaning of the words that are being conveyed. And so this next slide shows, using the template that the IEP team came up with, a couple different ideas to look at the accommodations that the team felt may work for the student. I'm just going to flip here where it's a little bigger so I can see it again. So the first accommodation there was preferential seating for the student, specifically sitting with his right ear closer to the teacher or the person who's giving the directions. And they noted, as the IEP team, that that accommodation met all the needs for the student. It was something necessary. It was something that the student could independently do. It was something that he or she would be able to use in all of the classes. And then the student was okay with that accommodation as well. And it's also acceptable on the FCAT or FSA. In this case, this is a little bit older manual. The second accommodation was looking at providing a copy of the notes and a study guide in specific classes, language arts and world history. And there again, they went through the checklist to look at, is it going to meet all the areas that the student has? The last one, or the next last one, was a peer buddy to answer questions. And they decided that no, it was unnecessary. It was a good idea, but really not something the student was comfortable using and not something that was going to benefit him. And then the reduction of auditory distractions. So it was nice for them to go through that dialogue process, to brainstorm, to get together and say, here's the data, here's the areas that we know are an issue for this student. And then let's look at these ideas that we have, and is it something that the student is actually going to be able to use in the classroom or in the various classrooms that he or she would be in. This next slide addresses making sure that accommodations are effective. And I really like this because often if we've sat down, we've looked at, okay, we think the student will benefit from this accommodation, the student's willing to use the accommodation. We really need to look at, are we providing the student with the skills necessary to use the accommodation? One of the things I like to think about is exercising on a treadmill. It's the new year, many of us have probably set goals to get up and exercise a little bit more. So if you think about a treadmill, if you're not using it, if you're not actually using the equipment, how can you say that the equipment didn't work, didn't do the purpose, or didn't do what it was designed to do? And that's the same thing with our accommodations. If a student has an accommodation on their IEP, but they're not using it, how can we actually say or indicate that it was an effective or ineffective accommodation? So a couple of the areas to look at here is looking at, is there any material or device that the student is going to need? So who is going to be responsible for providing that? Is it going to be the ESE teacher? Is it going to be the SLP? Is it an assistive technology specialist who's going to provide that? So making sure that we're giving the student the training that they need, or providing what they need, first of all, for it. And then secondly, is there any initial setup? Does a student need to use a Sapphire, which is a magnifier device, to be able to read and access if it's a DSI kid? Who is going to be responsible for providing and making sure the student actually gets that item that they need? And then the third one is, who's going to train this student? Okay, so now you have this new device. We've all received new gadgets before and thought, oh, this is awesome. But if we didn't get the training, we didn't know how to use it, and probably eventually it ended up somewhere on the shelf collecting dust just because we didn't know what to do. So we need to make sure that we're not putting our students in the same situation, that they are getting the training that they need, either to use the accommodation, to know where a specific material or device is that they can get independently. And then we also need to make sure that the other teachers and other adults that are working with the student know how to use the accommodation as well. You could have one teacher who's just gung-ho about using a certain device or something, and they're using it effectively in the classroom, but then the student goes to the next teacher and they're using all this great stuff, and they come up to a little problem and need some help, and they raise the hand, and the teacher doesn't have that skill or doesn't know about it. So we have to look at it from all the aspects. We have to look at it from what kind of training does the student need to use the accommodation, and some could be more intense than others, but we also need to look at, are there additional supports for the teachers and for the staff as well, so that they can support the student in knowing how to use that accommodation as well. And then sometimes we need to make sure that the teacher knows how to integrate that accommodation in their day-to-day activities. We've seen that with technology on the uprise, and we see these wonderful technology devices, one-to-one computing. Students are provided with these one-to-one devices, but then they go into the classroom and the teacher hasn't been prepared to know how to help the student to engage in that. So it's very important that we're looking at all aspects of making sure the student knows how to use it, making sure the teacher is aware of how to use it, and importantly as well, how to integrate it into their teaching as well and using it. So all of that should be summed up in a way that it's indicated and clear on the present level of performance, what the student can do and what the student can't do. We should be able to justify or give some reasoning that present level of performance should be able to help guide you as an educator to see the flow of events, to see where the student's needs are, where the gaps are, where the goals are, and what accommodations are needed for the student to help them meet that. By having that clear flow, to having that documentation, you really help not only the student and the parent to understand, but you also help any other educator who's picking up that IEP and reading to make sure that they understand the content as well. Also, hopefully no one has had the experience, but that information is also very useful during a due process hearing. If you've ever been involved in that type of process before, there's a lot of documentation that is required, a lot of questions that are asked, and the more that we can indicate and clearly define for the parents why certain things were happening, why we did this, where the student is functioning at either academic or functionally, that's going to provide a benefit not only to the parents but also save us as educators. All right, I want to take a brief pause there for a minute. We've talked about classroom accommodations. A lot of our classroom accommodations are going to lead into assessment accommodations as well. As any assessment accommodations, if a student is not using something in the classroom, then they really shouldn't have that accommodation on the assessment if they're not using it in the classroom. It's also important to make sure, just had a brain lapse here, one moment. Fell out that quick. Okay, were there any questions before we switch into looking more at assessment level accommodations? Give a brief pause here if there's anything in the chat box. All right. So state assessment accommodations, every year the assessment office puts out, includes in the test administration manuals for the state assessments accommodations information. This year the state has developed a separate FSA accommodations guide, which is really neat. And most of your accommodation categories, they really break them down into the 5 areas of presentation, response, setting, scheduling, and any other assistive devices. We'll kind of go through now and look at each of those areas and what some of the areas may be that we look at for our deaf and hard of hearing students, or possibly any of our dual sensory impaired students as well. Under the flexible presentation accommodations, a common one is oral or signed presentation of the information. And this is important for our students who may need a different method than just listening to be able to access the information, whether that be through American Sign Language or a method like signing exact English or mouth movements. That presentation method is available. So we need to then consider and look back, what are the methods and the ways that the student is accessing that information in the classroom? Is it documented on the IEP that the student needs this accommodation? So one thing specifically about this accommodation in the administration manual is the fact that when you get to the reading assessment, it is specific on what content can be read, whereas in your math and science and history, civics, all of those, you are free to read anything to the student or sign anything to the student. But as far as reading, there are very specific guidelines and criteria on what can be read. So if you're unfamiliar with that, please make sure you check out the FSA website. It does have a document that really helps clearly define what can and can't be read and signed on that, on the FSA assessment. Also, a lot of our assessments now are computer-based. Once you get to the 4th grade level for reading and math and higher, with the exception of writing at 4th through 7th grade, but are moved to computer-based. And so paper-based assessments can still be requested for the student. So if you have a dual sensory impaired student who may need Braille or may need large print and has eye fatigue and can't use the computer, that's the kind of information and data that we should be gathering on what the student needs are and how they're functioning in the classroom. One of the things that's great is in the past couple of years also they've added ASL to the computer assessments and closed captioning. So, we do have the option in looking at the accommodation. If a student is not using ASL, but they do need sign support, you can have an accommodation to be able to, as the teacher, to be able to sign that listening passage for the student, as well as closed captioning. If a student uses that in their regular room, if there is C-print, if they use C-print or caption print in the classroom as their accommodation, then that's an accommodation that we need to look at, making sure it's provided for the student on the assessment as well. Verbal encouragement, making sure that the student is encouraged to continue to working. Passage booklets are another one, probably not something that we see as much on the deaf and hard of hearing side, but for students who, if they're working on the computer and they do have that eye fatigue, they could have a separate passage booklet for the reading section that has all the reading passages if they need that. Text to speech, any of our students who do have enough hearing to use that could have that as a mechanical reader versus a human reader. Color transparencies, one of the things, so we talked about universal design a little bit earlier, but with the use of the computer-based assessments, most of the accommodations are provided for all of the students, whether that be, in this case, like the color transparencies, the color overlays. You can change the background color, the text color. You can zoom in on the information on the assessments. You can change the mouse size, the mouse colors. So those are those kind of universally designed accommodations that are available to all the students there. Flexible responding for some of our students, speech-to-text technology to record responses. If you have a student who may have cerebral palsy and is unable to write lengthy passages or such, they may be able to use that speech-to-text technology to have the responses recorded. Students who may, again, like I said, have difficulty writing could use a computer to type the responses. Students may need things like special paper, lined paper, checks to make sure they're working in the correct sections and areas. They can use their communication devices. If they're using any of their AACs or anything like that, any computer switches. So it's important to, again, going back, looking at what is the expectation for the student, and then where are any gaps, and what are the accommodations that as an IEP team we've discussed, student included, that they need to use and feel like they will use. Flexible scheduling is also one that we should be looking. Are we providing that similar accommodation in the classroom? Does the student need their work broken down over several brief periods to be able to complete a task so they don't become so overwhelmed? Do you have a student that does better in the afternoon than in the morning? And that's something that's documented on their IEP. Does the student need extended time because of the student's hearing impairment, their deafness? Is it something that they need additional time to be able to read and process information? And so they need the additional time to complete their assessment more than what was allotted in the regular assessment. And so those are the kinds of things that we look at, that we process. And extended time, is it double the amount of time that the student needs? Does a student usually take twice as long on their assignment? Does a student usually only need maybe an extra 15 minutes per assignment? So really looking at and identifying what are the student needs specific to what they are doing. And then flexible setting, reduce stimuli, whether it be visual or auditory stimuli for our students. If you do have students who have enough hearing, some students may benefit from a white noise machine to help them keep them from distraction from any ambient noises that are happening within the classroom. As well as some students just perform better based on individual or small group settings. If most of their classes are happening in a small classroom, in a separate classroom, then all of a sudden they get put into a huge auditorium with all these students. What is that going to do to the student, how they perform on the assessment? So again, just looking at and documenting what are the needs for the student and based on what information you have. And then as any assistive devices, if you have a dual sensory impaired student who may need a visual magnification, or they need direct input to the teacher through their auditory device, they're using an English to sign language dictionary, calculators for students who are 7th grade and older. It's important. So one of the things I finally remembered what I was thinking about earlier is sometimes when we have classroom accommodations, we know it's an accommodation that a student is going to need. And sometimes those accommodations aren't allowed on the state assessment. And if that's the case, we need to make sure that we are letting the parent know that that accommodation is not allowed on the state assessment, and and the parent actually has to sign a physical form related with the IEP stating that they acknowledge that the student is receiving an accommodation that is not allowable on the IEP itself, or not allowable on the state assessment. So that's something that we need to consider is this accommodation necessary enough for the student that we still want it to it still needs to be provided to them even though they can't use it on the state assessment. And then parents need to understand the implications of that. If you have a student, I'll just pick math, who without a calculator cannot do the calculations at a 4th grade level, and yet they understand the concepts, but they require that accommodation, we have to make it very clear to the parents, and they have to sign that acknowledgement that if the student is provided with this accommodation, that it's not something that's allowable on the state assessment. The state assessment does not allow calculators before 7th grade. And so by allowing to use the calculator in the classroom prior to that, then the student is really going to be at a disadvantage and not going to be able to demonstrate their knowledge when it comes time for the state assessment. So a couple of the other areas to look at when we look at computer-based testing is sometimes we can assume that students know, they interact with technology every day, and so they should know how to do everything. We really need to take time to make sure that the student is aware of how to use the mouse, how to use the scroll bar, how to navigate between different areas within the assessment setting. Do they know how to zoom? Do they know how to use the tools that are built in as part of the FSA? And one of the things that's so wonderful about the test being online is students can start at the beginning of the school year accessing the state assessments and looking at making sure they're familiar with the tools. If they need that direct instruction a couple repeat times to be able to understand how they need to access that information. So that's also another important thing for the students to make sure that they have had sufficient practice, that they've also had practice with the types of questions that are going to be asked, the technology enhanced questions, if that's something that the student is doing as well. Oh, and I had mentioned this earlier, but with the computer-based testing, the accessibility settings, all students have access to be able to change the print size, the background color, the pointer size, to have the zoom, to have the highlighter. Those are all built-in accommodations they've just found are best practice to allow students access to. But those accommodations like text-to-speech, where the computer is actually going to read it to you, masking, American Sign Language, closed captioning, those are accommodations that specifically have to be turned on in the in the FSA that are based on what is in a student's IEP. All right, and so I have two references, both of which are in the file pod, which are the Selecting Accommodations Guide, which we talked about a little bit earlier, and then the Developing Quality IEPs, or QIEP manual. Both of those are great resources. I know the Quality IEP manual is in the process of being updated again as in continual draft form as information changes and as updates are made. And so we should be seeing an even newer version coming out soon, but the 2015 version is there in the pod for you. So now I'd like to take the opportunity to turn it over to you, ask you what questions that you may have, or any thoughts that you had that came to your mind as we were participating today. All right, I see some typing in the chat box. We'll just wait for a minute here. I feel like we need some Jeopardy music in the silence to kind of mask the the lull there. All right, the first question is, can anyone tell me what dictionary or dictionaries are approved for signers? What I've used in the past has been pretty useless in helping my students. That is a great question. I would have to step out for just a second to grab the dictionaries that I use, but the ones that are approved as far as the state are dictionaries that do not have any definition. So it's really just a word to sign dictionary. There can't be any definition regarding what that word means. It's just you have a word and to be able to use the sign. I'll pop out real quick and grab the two that I have so I can tell you what those are. Give me just one moment.
And while he's doing that, I can tell you that in some districts, teachers have actually had to create their own dictionaries because of the lack of resources available. There are some that are approved. Of course, nothing is going to have every sign that you need. We were just talking about today, also, there is a digital sign language dictionary, both for Apple and Android devices, that can be used, but you have to break it down so that it has absolutely no access to the internet in order to be able to use it on statewide assessments.
Thank you for that. The two dictionaries that we use usually the kids refer to them as the gold and the red, white, and blue dictionary, is the Random House Webster's American Sign Language Dictionary. It's by Elaine Costello. And it just has, oops, I apologize. That gold one is not one of the ones. Sorry, that one actually had definitions in it, so that is not the one. I apologize. Well, I do apologize. I don't have those. I thought we did. I do not have the correct ones. These are the ones we use for students in the classroom, not for testing, so I apologize for that. I thought I had them. Thank you, Jamie. Jamie Ronda says, we use the American Sign Language Hand-Shaped Dictionary for ASL to English and the Gallaudet Dictionary of American Sign Language for English to ASL. Okay, so Joanna said, do you know if there is a list of accommodations that are not allowable on assessments? So in the assessment manual for the 2017-18 FSA Accommodations Guide, it does list accommodations that are allowable, and then it has a section for unique accommodations. So there may be, in the process of looking, you may be able to request a unique accommodation for your student, making sure that it doesn't violate the constructs of the assessment. So the assessment manual, it lists many accommodations, but that doesn't mean you're only limited to those accommodations. Anything that's not listed, you would need to contact the state to be able to see if that is an allowable accommodation. And so that 2017-18 FSA Accommodations Guide can be found on fsassessments.org under their resources section. And really it's the same that was in the back of the old test administration manuals. They just have a separate one that you can look at. Thank you, Sherry, for writing that down for me. So that does have a good list of those accommodations, and it'd be good to go ahead and check your students to make sure that their IEPs are reflected if they are using those accommodations in the classroom, that they're also listed on the assessment section as well. And if there are no further questions for me, I will turn it back over to Sherry.
Scott, thank you so much. What a great topic, and very timely as we're getting ready to move into that very busy assessment season. We really appreciate you taking the time to share with our participants the information that you've brought today. So just once again, thank you so much. And to all of our participants, thank you so much for allowing us to be a part of your day. We do love hearing from you guys, and all of us are happy to help in any way we can. You can connect with us through social media like Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest. If you go and check Twitter, you might see a quote posted from this very presentation. You can also sign up for our newsletter. We would love to hear your comments on this or any other presentation on social media, and we ask that you use the hashtags RMTC-DHH and hashtag RMTC-DHH TA Live so that all of those comments can be found in one place. As you know, we are a B's discretionary project, and all of the services that RMTC provides are free. One way that we can continue to do that is by collecting survey data to justify why our services are needed. If each of you could please complete the survey right now, we would greatly appreciate it. You can see a link to our survey in the pod in Adobe. If you had a colleague who missed this broadcast, or if you'd like to watch it again, you can head over to rmtc-dhh.org/TA Live for this and all of our other past presentations, and the captions will continue to be in those as well, so they're accessible for for those that need that accommodation. If there are no other questions, we would bid you all a very good afternoon. And thank you again to Scott for joining us today and sharing information about accommodation.